When I was young, I had a favourite book. It was called The Matter of Wales and was written by Jan Morris. History books can be a bit dry, but this one is a compelling read. One of the fascinating characters I learned about was Edward Williams, better known by his bardic name of Iolo Morgannwg, a mason, a farmer, a grocer and a forger, and the bane of historians for decades. Iolo wrote manuscripts that proved that the Druidic traditions of Celtic Wales had survived the Roman conquest. It was a lie. Nevertheless, to this day, members of the Gorsedd Cymru are known as Druids, and the Druid's Prayer, written by Iolo, is a staple of Welsh national eisteddfodau. It was many years after I first read that book that I learned that, among many other adventures that most of us can only dream of, Jan Morris, then known as James, was the Times correspondent who accompanied Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay on the expedition to conquer the summit of Everest. Morris married and fathered 5 children before, in 1972, at the age of 45, he travelled to Morocco to undergo gender reassignment surgery. After 48 years identifying as a woman, Jan Morris died in November 2020. The formation of a national identity is a creative endeavour. I suspect that Morris's experience of creating her own identity as a woman gave her an insight into that process that other authors simply do not have. In an earlier book entitled Conundrum, Morris explained that she was 3 or 4 when she realised that she had been born into the wrong body and should have really been a girl. I can understand that. We all rationalise our own experiences so they make sense to us. I'm a big admirer of Jan Morris, but I don't believe her subjective rationalisation is an objective truth. Unless you believe that we all have a gendered soul, how can it be? We are our bodies. The First Minister of Wales appears to disagree. In response to a question from Senedd member Laura Ann Jones, Mark Drakeford said,
Well, Llywydd, my starting point is the same as Penny Mordaunt, the UK minister responsible at the time, who said that the UK government's starting point was that transgender women are women. And that's my starting point in this debate.
Trans women are not women. This is a lie. Mark Drakeford's response is indicative of the ideological capture of the Welsh Government, a government with devolved responsibility for the education and health of our young people. To cement a sense of Welsh national identity, Iolo Morgannwg lied. The legacy of his lie is to be found in Eisteddfod rituals and the writings of vexed historians. The legacy of the lie of gender identity ideology is of a different nature. It is to be found in the messed up minds and medicalised and mutilated bodies of our children. How we got here is a complex story. It starts with a change to the law. In the 1960s, an American professor of psychiatry, Robert Stoller, and a New Zealand psychologist, John Money, started using the term gender identity to refer to an individual's personal concept about their gender and how they feel inside. This term was used again in 1980 within a publication by the American Psychiatric Association called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM. It was used in a description of the psychological malady of what is now known as gender dysphoria, the distress a person feels due to a mismatch between the personal sense of one's own gender and their biological sex. Christine Goodwin suffered with gender dysphoria. She was a man living in the UK, but underwent sex reassignment surgery in 1990. As her birth certificate identified her as male, she couldn't draw a pension at age 60. She also faced sexual harassment at work and was unable to marry a man. In 2002, she took a legal case to the European Court of Human Rights. The court found that the Miss Goodwin case comprised a violation of Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life, of the European Convention on Human Rights, and a violation of Article 12, the right to marry and to found a family. Psychotherapists working with transsexual patients at the Portman Clinic in London expressed concerns over the ruling and wrote a letter to the Times. The letter included this line: "The recent legal victory risks reinforcing a false belief that it is possible to actually change a person's gender. It might also strengthen the view that the only solution to psychic pain is a legal or surgical one." Among the signatories was a young doctor from North Wales, Dr. Az Hakim. Largely in response to this case, in 2004, the UK government passed the Gender Recognition Act. This was a landmark act. For the first time, transsexuals could apply to receive a gender recognition certificate. This allows them to obtain a birth certificate showing their legally recognised acquired sex. It was the expectations of the legislators that most applicants would medically transition. However, it was decided not to insist on surgery being a prerequisite for obtaining a certificate, but instead to add some eligibility criteria. Applicants must be over 18, have lived in their acquired gender for 2 years, and have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. As it turned out, the expectation of the legislators has proven to be incorrect. Most males who transition do not undergo gender surgery. The UK became the first country in the world to allow gender recognition without the requirement for surgery. The pressure to make it easier for trans people to self-identify their sex was about to increase. In the same year that the Gender Recognition Act was passed in the UK, human rights lawyer and former Catholic priest Michael O'Flaherty joined the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva. In 2005, John Fisher, a lawyer and co-director of ARC International, a Canadian lobbying group, relocated to Geneva with the goal of influencing UN policymakers. Following work by O'Flaherty and Fisher, in 2006, 29 human rights advocates from around the globe were invited to attend a conference in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, to formulate a set of principles for the protection of the rights of people with atypical sexual orientation and gender identity. The resulting document became known as the Yogyakarta Principles. Although not approved by the United Nations, the language of the document mirrors the language used in international rights law and aims for the application of the same human rights legislation for persons of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. Sexual orientation and gender identity are completely different. Yet these two disparate facets of our humanity were linked together. In a speech for the Institute of International and European Affairs, Michael O'Flaherty stated,
what we did there was we identified what the experience of life is for a person who self-identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender, and then we mapped those experiences onto the international human rights commitments. It was a document that became known as the Yogyakarta Principles.
Most people do not regard sexual orientation as something you identify into. But this is what happens if you lump these two things together. It warps our language. The sections of the principles related to sexual orientation are commendable. Indeed, in many parts of the world, same-sex sexual acts are still illegal. These sections are important. However, Principle 3b instructs all states to take all necessary legislative, administrative, and other measures to fully respect and legally recognize each person's self-defined gender identity. The principle instructs states to drop the safeguarding aspect for legal recognition and to implement self-ID. This was something that, at the time, had not been implemented anywhere in the world. Robert Wintermute, Professor of Human Rights Law at King's College London, was one of the signatories of the Yogyakarta Principles. He has now changed his mind.
In 2007, when only the UK had a law of this kind, the second transgender demand became Principle 3 of the Yogyakarta Principles, a civil society document which purports to state the minimum requirements of international human rights law, and is often cited in the UK, as Bev said, as representing international best practice. In 2012, Argentina became the first country to accept at the national level the third transgender demand: change of legal sex without safeguards, based solely on self-identification, with no diagnosis or waiting period. Since 2014 in Europe, the Argentine model has been adopted by at least 7 countries: Denmark, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, Norway, and Switzerland, and is currently being considered by Spain. In April 2017, in the case of AP Garçon and Nico versus France, the Strasbourg Court declined to make the third transgender demand, self-identification, a minimum European standard, because so few countries had adopted the Argentine model. The court did, however, make the second transgender demand, no surgery, a minimum European standard, even though it was the law in only 18 of 47 Council of Europe member states, including the UK. The no surgery aspect of the GRA, which was optional in 2004, is thus now required by the case law of the Strasbourg Court. In November 2017, the second version of the Yogyakarta Principles incorporated the fourth transgender demand. Principle 31 claims that, under existing international human rights law, every country in the world has an obligation to end the registration of the sex of the person in identity documents such as birth certificates. Until this is done, the third transgender demand, self-identification, must be adopted. No eligibility criteria, such as a psychomedical diagnosis or minimum age, shall be a prerequisite to change one's legal sex. With regard to change of legal sex, the Yogyakarta Principles are not a neutral statement of international human rights law, but rather a radical advocacy document. I would argue that the GRA is very generous and that the UK Parliament should not amend it for England and Wales, or the Scottish Parliament for Scotland, especially because the Strasbourg Court does not require us to amend it. Proponents of change consider the requirement of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to be humiliating or stigmatizing. But we must remember that a transgender person seeking a change of legal sex is asking for an exemption from the general rule that a person's birth sex is their legal sex for life because their birth sex never changes. Exemptions have conditions. We can justifiably attach conditions to crossing the legal border from male to female or female to male, just as we attach conditions to crossing an international border, acquiring a new citizenship, being granted refugee status, being approved as an adoptive parent, obtaining disability benefits, or being granted the status of conscientious objector to military service. In none of these situations is it sufficient to self-identify as a visitor, citizen, refugee, adoptive parent, disabled person, or conscientious objector without an assessment process. The transgender rights movement has gone well beyond seeking equal rights. It seeks to liberate women, without their consent, from the legal protections associated with birth sex, and even from the recording of birth sex. Better protection of the human rights of a very small minority must not come at the expense of the human rights of the majority of the population. In closing, I would like to say that I've changed my mind with regard to certain transgender demands, including access to women-only spaces, after listening to women. Men are rarely, if ever, affected by transgender demands, so it is easy to say yes. We must always try to imagine ourselves in the changing rooms, hospital wards, and prisons of lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual women. Thank you.
There is no information on the Principles website about who paid for the conference or on what basis the human rights lawyers were selected for invitation. There is no explanation of why the decision was taken to merge discussions on sexual orientation and gender identity into one conference, or why it was not thought relevant to invite experts on therapeutic treatment of patients with gender dysphoria. This demonstrates a lack of transparency that is a recurring theme in the advancement of trans demands. There is no discussion about the potential of conflict with women's rights. Yet, on the Yogyakarta Principles website, it states that the Yogyakarta Principles are a universal guide to human rights which affirm binding international legal standards with which all states must comply. Why should we take any notice of them at all? Kate Harris, a co-founder of LGB Alliance, talks about how they have achieved such extraordinary influence.
So what's really interesting for me as a lawyer, I understand that these principles have got no legal standing, and yet they appear to be relied upon, cited, written about. They're some kind of human rights instrument. On a par with, say, the UN Convention or the European Convention. So how did that happen?
It's interesting you should say that. I've been looking at an article. It's actually an interview with Stephen Whittle, who was an early campaigner via Press for Change. He was born a female and transitioned to a trans woman. And he was invited along at quite late in the process to join discussions in 2007. This article, he says, it was important that it was not an official document of the UN, but at the same time, it placed within the UN a clear and accurate statement of the rights of people regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or birth status. They have become almost part of the UN system. Often it is assumed that the YP came from the UN. They are acknowledged by legal experts worldwide as being a clear statement of human rights values for LGBTI people. Now, why did it happen? It's a very good question, but what we do know and how we know it is largely thanks to a report that was sponsored by Thomson Reuters and Dentons in conjunction with IGLIO. This was a report produced in November 2019, all about good practice in legal gender recognition for youth. And what we've learned is that it is a very, very strong, strongly promoted and strongly followed strategy to stay under the radar. So we think, although we don't know, that the reason, Stephen Whittle says in this article, again, what has surprised me was how little criticism there's been of the principles. Well, nobody knows about them. Hardly anybody knows about them. Hardly anybody knew that self-ID was suddenly going to be attached to equal marriage in Ireland. These are the tactics that are used over and over again by these gender identity campaigners to change the law, keep out of the press, and keep below the radar to get their agenda accepted. And one of our jobs at LGB Alliance is to constantly shine a light on the campaigning that has been done that is destroying the rights of same-sex attracted people, destroying freedom of speech for everybody, and destroying the lives of children who are growing up and told really complete fantasy instead of taught biology and the law at school. So we need to highlight YP. We need to highlight the fact that it is not legally binding. We need to highlight the fact that gender identity is a minority belief, and we accept that people can have beliefs. We accept people are protected for their beliefs. They should not be discriminated against. But gender identity is, in our minds, a fiction, and therefore it should not be referenced in any way at all.
Gender identity cannot be scientifically or logically shown to exist. And yet the Welsh Government believe that self-identifying your gender is a human right. The principles have proven to be extremely influential. They have even been referenced in support of the use of puberty blockers for children struggling with gender dysphoria. In 1998, an article entitled "Pubertal Delay as an Aid in Diagnosis and Treatment of a Transsexual Adolescent" was published in the journal European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. The article described the very first use of puberty blockers on a child struggling with gender dysphoria. Puberty blockers are a class of drug known as gonadotropin-releasing hormone analogues. By using puberty blockers, the physical changes to the body that come with the progression of puberty are suppressed. But these drugs have never been licensed for treatment of gender dysphoria. Peggy Cohen-Kettenis, the lead author of the initial study, has gone on to become a highly influential figure at WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Her co-author, Stephanie Van Hoosen, is a professor at Cardiff University. She has since moved on to other areas of research. Surprisingly, under a list of publications on the Cardiff University website, there is no reference to the groundbreaking article of 1998. There is, however, a reference to an earlier article from 1997, which followed up 22 of the first adolescent transsexual patients. Dr. Norman Spack from Boston Children's Hospital in the United States became an enthusiastic advocate of puberty blockers after visiting Amsterdam. In a TED talk he delivered in 2014, he talked about the transgender adolescents he saw. He said, "Once they gave them the hormones consistent with the gender they affirm, they looked beautiful. They looked normal." In 2007, he set up the first clinic in the United States that offered what would become known as gender-affirming care, providing puberty blockers to children suffering with gender dysphoria, later followed by cross-sex hormones. One of his patients was a highly effeminate young male, originally named Jack, but who socially transitioned to Jackie at age 10. Jack liked girl toys and dressing up in girl clothes, but his father disapproved. Jack was also bullied at school. At 12 years old, Jackie's mother Susie took him to Boston for treatment under Norman Spack. Jackie's puberty was blocked with a blocking hormone, and estrogen was administered at age 13. At the age of 16, Jackie was taken to Thailand for gender reassignment surgery. Susie Green went on to become CEO of Mermaids, a charity for children with gender dysphoria, and is a very strong advocate for the use of puberty blockers. Michael Biggs, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oxford, speaks of the origin of what would become known as the Dutch Protocol.
Puberty blockers are a class of drugs known as gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonist, abbreviated to GnRHA. And they're also sometimes called LHRH, but it's the same thing. They block the production of sex hormones, they block the production of estrogen in females and testosterone in males. In the UK and the Netherlands, the drug is triptorelin. In America, the drug is a slightly different formula, and it's marketed as Lupron, but it has exactly the same effect. Now, these drugs have never been licensed to treat gender dysphoria. They've never been licensed for this condition anywhere in the world. What the conditions they are licensed for is, first of all, precocious puberty in children, where puberty starts abnormally young, let's say under 7 years old for girls. And this is the condition that is used by gender clinicians to justify treating gender dysphoria, even though the two have really nothing in common. Because the drugs stop sex hormones, they're also used to treat some reproductive problems in women, though it's interesting that women can only allowed to take them for up to 6 months because they have such serious consequences. And they're also used to treat prostate cancer in men, and in fact GnRHA was first developed to treat prostate cancer. So one of the licensed use should be mentioned, and that is the treatment of what is called severe sexual deviation in men. But plainly, they're used to chemically castrate sex offenders. A recent review actually warned that they should be used only for the worst sex offenders because they have, to quote, extensive side effects. So to an outside observer, it does seem a bit odd to give the same drugs to children suffering from gender dysphoria as are used to chemically castrate sex offenders. Where did this idea come from? So here's the article that introduced puberty suppression to the medical community. The title is The Feasibility of Endocrine Interventions in Juvenile Transsexuals. Note the phrase, juvenile transsexuals. The first author is Louis Geuren. Forgive me mangling his Dutch surname. He was the world's first professor of transsexology, and he was based for many years at the Free University of Amsterdam. The second article, which is the one that's more often cited, is Pubertal Delay as an Aid in Diagnosis and Treatment of a Transsexual Adolescent from 1998. Transsexual adolescent is also a phrase to keep in mind. The first author of this article is Peggy Cohen-Kettenis, who was then based at the University of Utrecht, and then she subsequently moved to the same university in Amsterdam. So this article described the very first case of puberty suppression. This is a girl known as B, who was a tomboy. She played with boys' toys. There was conflict with her father, quite a lot of problems in the family, and at 12 she even threatened suicide. At the age of 13, her psychiatrist and a pediatric endocrinologist decided therefore to delay B's puberty by triptorelin treatment. Using this hormone, she started to feel better about herself, thus allowing her therapist to explore gender issues for an extended period. The exploration lasted until 18, and then she very quickly went through the transsexual process. Testosterone, double mastectomy, removal of her uterus and ovaries, legal sex change, and finally, genital surgery. According to Cohen-Kettenis and her co-authors, this apparently completely cured her. B reported no gender dysphoria at all. And that's after a year. B never felt any regrets. B is happy and studying to be a doctor. So we can see why this article had such an impact on clinicians working with kids with gender dysphoria. Puberty suppression almost seems to be a miracle cure, which could enable a perfect sex change, if only you could start early enough. We'll come back to the case of B later on in the video, but meanwhile, as an exercise for the viewer, why don't you take a guess at B's sexual orientation? Do you think she's erotically attracted to women or to men or both? So we could begin by trying to understand what motivated these clinicians, the father and the mother of puberty blockers. Well, Heron believed that some people are born with a brain of the opposite sex. So he stood in the long tradition, started with John Money, who invented the notion of gender in the 1950s, the notion that transsexualism was kind of like an intersex condition, what we'd now call a disorder of sexual development. So the argument goes that you can't change someone's brain, so you have to change their body to match their brain. That's the only solution. For Cohen-Kettenis, the motivation was a bit more practical. She ran a gender clinic for young people in Utrecht, and she'd begun to lower the age for cross-sex hormones from 18 down to 16. And her findings, she argued, she argued was that it was much better to start younger. Transsexuals who started earlier were more likely to pass, and as a result, they were much happier, much better, more well-adjusted. So, of course, logically, the next step was to lower the age further. Hence, what became the Dutch Protocol. So, under this protocol, at the age of 12, a child will become eligible for puberty blockers. At 16, the child will go into cross-sex hormones. And at 18, they would go for their surgeries. And in the Netherlands, genital surgery was standard. So there's a really kind of a very straightforward conveyor belt. Puberty blockers, hormones, surgery. Now, Dutch clinicians were aware, because they were starting young, they did say that they imposed quite strict eligibility criteria for puberty blockers. First, the gender dysphoria should have begun early in childhood. How they would actually know that is unclear. Presumably they'd have to rely on the patient's own recollection and the family's recollection. Also, the dysphoria should have become worse with the onset of puberty. Second, the patient should be psychologically stable and not suffer from other mental health problems. And third, the patient needed to have the support and approval of their family. So these eligibility criteria were usually forgotten when the Dutch Protocol was adopted in other countries. What was taken was simply the idea of puberty blockers at 12. And in other countries, the age of 12 was soon reduced, because after all, some children start puberty earlier, and so you need to go younger than 12. In England, for example, the youngest so far is 10 years old. One more thing about the Dutch Protocol is that Ferring Pharmaceuticals was remarkably generous with financial support, and that, of course, is the company that manufactures triptorelin. So let's look a little more closely at the Dutch Protocol. So the first thing is the connection between gender dysphoria and homosexuality. In Geuren's first article on puberty blockers, there's an intriguing statement. Not all children with gender atypicality will turn out to be transsexuals later in life. Several prospective studies in gender atypical boys show that this childhood behavior correlates considerably stronger with future homosexuality than with transsexualism. So doesn't that raise the prospect that most of Geuren's juvenile transsexuals are really homosexuals to be, or homosexuals in waiting? The passage continues with something that seems to be a non sequitur. Some of the youngsters will turn out to be genuinely transsexual in their mid-teens. But that's some, not all. And starting at 12 means starting, of course, before the mid-teens. Yet the claim is that there is no reasonable expectation that their cross-sex gender identity will ever more change. Here they cite articles by Cohen-Kett in this, which actually don't provide any evidence that cross-sex gender identity never changes. It just simply describes how she is operating her clinic in Utrecht. So a later review article by Cohen-Kett and Geuren repeat the same point. Not all children with gender identity disorder, and that's just the earlier term for what we now call gender dysphoria, not all children with gender dysphoria will turn out to be transsexuals after puberty. Prospective studies of gender dysphoric boys show that this phenomenon is more closely related to later homosexuality. Again, the same kind of puzzle. And this puzzle has never, as far as I tell, been tackled. Let me illustrate what exactly is the problem here. And I'm using here on an excellent recent article by Lee, Kung and Hines, which uses data from a large cohort study of kids born in Bristol in England. Lee very kindly shared the data from the article so I could make my own graphs, and the details of the study and my graphs, my analysis is posted on the website Fourth Wave now. So when these kids were almost 5 years old, their parents were asked about what sort of toys they like and who they played with. Their answers were used to create an index of gendered activities. And so from masculine to feminine. And of course, naturally, by definition, there's a real clear difference between boys and girls on average. But some boys actually resemble girls more than or the typical girl more than they resemble the typical boy. They're on the left-hand side of that, the histogram in red at the bottom. Obviously just a few percent, but nevertheless, there are quite a few of them. Now guess what, when the same kids were followed up 10 years later? Age 15, the children were asked about their sexual orientation. As you can see, the boys who had preferred, as small children, more feminine activities were far, far, far more likely to identify as gay. Although note that still it was only a small minority. At the maximum, you would predict only 20%. Oh, of course, we would expect some of them would come out as gay later. 15 is still young. And exactly the same pattern holds for girls, although it's not quite as pronounced as it is for boys. Now, it's important to note that one of the criteria used to diagnose gender dysphoria in children is engaging, and I'm quoting, engaging in play activities characteristic of the opposite sex. Remember how the case of B emphasized how that she had played with boys' toys. So it would be nice to know how practitioners of gender medicine distinguish a transsexual from a homosexual. One path requires lifelong medical treatment, the other does not. Now let's take the claim for reversibility. This is one of the key claims justifying the Dutch protocol. In Geuren's initial article, the effects of puberty blockers are fully reversible. In other words, no lasting undesired effects are to be expected. Side effects are few, particularly when there is usage only for a limited period of 3 to 18 months. So presumably Geuren was thinking about using puberty blockers for a limited time, but of course B used them for 5 years, from ages 13 to 18. And when adopted elsewhere, kids can start, outside the Netherlands, kids can start as young as 10, so that's 6 years to 16, 10 to 16 when they can take cross-sex hormones. An article 10 years later repeats the same mantra of reversibility. But a hint of doubt appears later in the same article. During puberty, developmental processes also take place in the brain. It is not clear yet how pubertal suppression will influence brain development. So one might think that the effects of puberty on brain development and the suppression of puberty on brain development would have warranted investigation at the outset. But it certainly calls this claim about reversibility into serious question. Another mantra in the Dutch protocol is diagnostic. This treatment is a very helpful diagnostic aid, as it allows the psychologist and the patient to discuss problems that possibly underlie the cross-gender identity or clarify potential gender confusion. Hypothetically then, puberty blockers enable you to diagnose who is truly a juvenile transsexual and who is gender dysphoric but not transsexual, for example, just a gender non-conforming gay or lesbian, or for that matter, bisexual or heterosexual. But the same article later admits none of the patients who were selected for pubertal suppression has decided to stop taking GnRHA. Since then, we know that almost everyone who takes puberty blockers goes on to cross-sex hormones. The figures, and this is not just the Netherlands, but in other countries as well, like Britain, the figures are kind of always something like 97%, 98%, or 99%. So this is a very strange, a very peculiar diagnostic test, for it almost always yields the same result. One last point to be made about the Dutch protocol. The aim is to block the development of sexual characteristics to avoid subsequent interventions to get rid of those characteristics. For example, a boy won't develop an Adam's apple, and so he won't need a tracheal shave surgery. He won't develop facial hair, so he won't need electrolysis. However, there is one major downside for males. It was acknowledged, as far as I can tell, only in 2008. Genital surgery for males uses the penis to form the inside of the newly created orifice, or neovagina. But puberty suppression means that the penis is likely to be too small, because after all, you have a man with the body, with the penis of a pubescent boy. As Cohen Kettenis and colleagues write reassuringly, the genital tissue available for vaginoplasty may be less than optimal. However, appropriate adjusted techniques exist to deal with the shortage of tissue. This is using a portion of the patient's bowel to line the new orifice. But this is a much less common and more difficult surgery to create a vaginoplasty. So suppressing puberty has one significant disadvantage for a male transsexual, which needs to be balanced against the potential advantages. So let's finally return to B, the very first adolescent given puberty blockers. B was followed up after 22 years since GnRHA was prescribed. At that point, B was aged 35 years old. When you read the abstract of the article, this appears, this looks like a clear success. B was in good health. B had bone density within the normal range. And this is one thing I didn't discuss, that puberty blockers prevent bones growing as they should, though this seems to be recovered when cross-sex hormones are taken. There's some concern about B's height because appearance is really important for these clinicians, and not just the Dutch. It's quite widespread in gender medicine, a lot of concern about trans women being too tall and trans men being too short. But as the abstract concludes, negative side effects are limited. So it seems great. But then when we start reading the text, we learn that We learn that B is good looking. Again, this emphasis on appearance. But B's relationships really have not worked out so well. B broke up with his girlfriend due to shame about his genital appearance and his feelings of inadequacy in sexual matters. B was rather sad and indeed depressed, although didn't meet the threshold of clinical depression. So B's situation hardly seems a great advertisement for the Dutch protocol. It's true that B didn't regret the path taken, but then, of course, regret would be rather pointless once you've made such a series of irreversible decisions. What's remarkable is that Cohen-Kettenis and her co-authors can't envisage any counterfactual, any possibility of the 13-year-old girl dealing differently with her gender dysphoria and following another path. So let me conclude by repeating some questions that are raised by the Dutch experiment. As we've seen, the justification for puberty blockers is contradictory. On one hand, the drugs are supposedly a diagnostic tool for discovering whether someone is, or perhaps should be, a transsexual. On the other hand, the drugs are the first stage of sex change. This is clear in the titles of the original articles. Remember, juvenile transsexuals, transsexual adolescent. By the mid-2000s, if not before, it was clear that adolescents given puberty blockers will almost always progress to cross-sex hormones and surgery. Were the Dutch clinicians and subsequent clinicians in other countries incredibly skilled at identifying those juvenile transsexuals? Or did the process of labeling a child as a juvenile transsexual tend to lock in the child's identity? Or, for that matter, did the drugs, by suppressing sexuality and suppressing cognitive development, prevent alternative ways for the kids to make sense and to overcome or to cope with their dysphoria? That leads to the next question. How do we know whether some of these transsexuals could not have grown into homosexual or indeed bisexual adults without needing hormones and without needing surgeries? After all, as the Dutch themselves pointed out, most boys suffering from gender dysphoria used to grow into gay men and girls into lesbians, or at least they used to before the era of puberty blockers. Third question, why did the Dutch clinicians never carry out a randomized controlled trial? That's the normal procedure to use when you invent a new experimental treatment. A randomized controlled trial provides real evidence on the treatment's safety and effectiveness. And note that even in the current public health crisis of COVID-19, despite the urgent need for a vaccine, vaccines have still gone through this process of going through a randomized controlled trial to make sure that they're safe and effective. And the Dutch didn't even test their new treatment on animals. It would have been easy to demonstrate whether puberty blockers are reversible, as they claimed. Only recently have scientists at the University of Glasgow actually done this kind of experiment on sheep, and they find that puberty blockers cause cognitive defects in spatial memory, and those defects do not disappear when the puberty blockers are stopped. The Dutch, however, used children as their guinea pigs. The final question is about the balance between, on one hand, appearance and on the other hand, sexuality and fertility. It's very clear reading the Dutch publications that their priority is looking good. They want these juvenile transsexuals to pass as the other sex. And of course, that obviously reflects the desires of the patients themselves, who desperately want to transform their appearance. But in all this, what bodies can do seems almost forgotten. Potentially negative effects on sexual pleasure, on libido, and on capacity to orgasm, and potentially negative effects on reproductive capacity are neglected. And so one really wonders whether the clinicians have got the balance right between what bodies look like and what bodies can do. So I hope my brief history has proved informative. Slides with all the references are posted on my website, which is linked in the description. Read sources and make up your own mind. And I'll leave the last word now to the father of puberty suppression, Louis Geuren.
But we are very, very reserved about this treatment. I mean, hormonally speaking, it's safe, but psychologically speaking, did we do the right thing? Do people of 13 never have second thoughts of what they are doing?
Biggs poses the question as to whether the Dutch protocol is creating rather than diagnosing transsexuals, and asks whether some transsexuals could have grown up to be gay, lesbian or bisexual adults. NHS Wales is unequivocal. On its website it states, "The exact cause of gender dysphoria is unclear. Gender dysphoria is not related to sexual orientation." Why NHS Wales are quite so dogmatic in this belief is not known. Dr. Norman Spack has similar strong convictions. In his TED Talk, Dr. Spack explained the diagnostic criteria he uses. At the time that puberty begins, that means between about age 10 to 12 in girls, 12 to 14 in boys, with breast budding or 2 to 3 times increase in the gonads in the case of genetic males. By that particular point, the child who says they're in the absolute wrong body is almost certain to be transgender and is extremely unlikely to change those feelings, no matter how anybody tries reparative therapy or any other noxious things. Puberty blockers allow the possibility for boys to grow up to look like girls, and girls to grow up to look like boys. As a money-making investment, it has fantastic potential. But there's a problem. A boy who exhibits feminine behavior is normal. It's not typical, but it's normal. A girl who exhibits masculine behavior is normal. It's not typical, but it's normal. Believing you are in the wrong body is not normal. We are our bodies. Now, gender dysphoria is very distressing. Many people who struggle with gender dysphoria will benefit from psychotherapeutic counselling to help them understand the factors that have given rise to these feelings. For some, transition may be the best option. The problem is, counselling doesn't pay. Not in the long term. If you can convince children who feel a little bit different that they are really in the wrong body, you have someone committed to puberty blockers and surgery with a lifelong dependence on cross-sex hormones. That's a lifelong revenue pipeline. So you need to normalize something that is abnormal. How would you do that? Well, you'd lobby the World Health Organization to remove gender dysphoria as a mental health condition. You'd make the case that refusing to let a child choose the sex they want to be is an infringement of their human rights. You'd forcefully merge the T with the LGB and pretend that they share the exact same set of ethical concerns. Most audaciously, you'd campaign for any reference to sex to be removed from the definitions of the words man and woman and boy and girl. Two philanthropic organisations that have been investing hundreds of millions of dollars in support of trans demands are Arcus Foundation and the Open Society Foundations. The president and founder of the Arcus Foundation is billionaire John Stryker. Stryker is heir to a multi-billion-dollar medical corporation. The chair and founder of the Open Society Foundations is billionaire George Soros. Soros is one of the most successful financial investors of all time. I don't know the motivations of these men, of course, but I think it's fair to observe that billionaires are rarely in the vanguard of social justice movements. In 2019, the global sex reassignment surgery industry was worth $316 million. By 2026, it is predicted to be worth $1.5 billion. It is estimated that it will grow annually at a compound growth rate of 25%. And that just includes the surgery, not the medication. In 2007, the same year that the Yogyakarta Principles were declared, and the same year Norman Spack founded the Gender Management Service Clinic at Boston's Children's Hospital, Arcus Foundation started massively funding organisations promoting trans rights demands. A signatory of the YP is trans man Mauro Cabral Greenspan. Greenspan became co-director of GATE, Global Action for Trans Equality, in 2010, a year after it was founded by fellow trans man Justus Eisfeld. A screenshot of its website, transactivists.org, from 2011 indicates that it was funded by Arcus Foundation and Open Society Foundations. From 2009 to 2019, Arcus Foundation donated $1,280,000 to GATE. From 2016 to 2020, the Open Society Foundations has donated $945,000. Figures before 2016 are not available. Between 2011 and 2013, it was the best funded trans organisation in the world. In the About page of the 2011 website, the organisation states its aims. Both the World Health Organization, WHO, and the American Psychiatric Association, APA, are reviewing the International Code of Diseases, ICD, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, which gives activists the unique opportunity to lobby for changes of the current mental health pathologization of trans identities. A report documenting a meeting in The Hague in 2011 between GATE representatives and WHO officials is on the GATE website. It is clear from the report that GATE are pushing for the requirement for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to be removed as a barrier to legal recognition. They are pushing for self-ID. The requirement for a medical diagnosis does provide some safeguarding for women. It is difficult to understand how weighing up conflicting rights between groups is the responsibility of the WHO. Nevertheless, GATE had success. The latest version of the ICD, ICD-11, was adopted by the 72nd World Health Assembly in 2019 and came into effect on 1st January 2022. The section on gender identity disorders was removed from its position under the section Mental and Behavioural Disorders, and a new subsection was created under the section Conditions Related to Sexual Health. It was entitled Gender Incongruence of Adolescence or Adulthood. In a House of Commons debate in 2022, Labour MP Lloyd Russell-Moyle argued that the requirement for a medical diagnosis should be removed from the eligibility criteria of a gender recognition certificate simply because the World Health Organization no longer diagnosed it as an illness.
Chairman, look, I think we've got to start with this debate, and actually I agree with some of the things that my honourable friend opposite, we sit on the same committee of constitutional affairs together, we work positively together. I agree that the debate has become toxic, and I agree that actually we need to find a way forward, and we need to show leadership. But I think we need to also step back and work out why there was a call initially, now over 4 years ago, for there to be changes. And that call was because the current Gender Recognition Act and gender recognition certificates were not working. They were not working because at the time the WHO, this is one of the reasons, was going through a process of removing gender dysphoria as a registered diagnosis. As this year, the World Health Organization no longer recognises gender dysphoria as a legitimate diagnosis that any doctor in the world should be giving. We now require our doctors to break WHO guidelines to continue to abide with the Gender Recognition Act. That alone, not talking even about the barriers to getting a Gender Recognition Act, the social problems, the issues and the trauma that it causes for people, the fact that it maybe doesn't actually properly reflect kind of the lived lives and the biology, because it only reflects actually the mental health diagnosis. Putting all of that aside, the very fact that we in this country are now requiring our doctors to give a diagnosis that is no longer internationally recognised should mean that we change the Act, even if it's changing the diagnosis and what a doctor or what a medical professional is looking at.
The World Health Organization were influenced by GATE, a trans activist organisation massively funded by philanthropic organisations founded by 2 billionaires. In September 2008, Michael O'Flaherty, a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, was a keynote speaker at a conference in Bellagio, Italy, organised by the Arcus Operating Foundation. O'Flaherty talked about the Yogyakarta Principles. He explained that human rights experts and activists had been informing and educating decision makers at national and international levels about the significance and usefulness of the principles, and they were having far more success than anticipated. In 2008 and 2009, co-organisers of the Yogyakarta Principles Conference, ARC International, received grants totaling almost $400,000 from Arcus Foundation to support their work to advance the recognition of human rights based on sexual orientation and gender identity at the international level. In 2013, ARC International was awarded a further $400,000 to strengthen the participation of LGBT groups in United Nations processes in support of LGBT rights. In 2016, Vitit Muntabaun, co-chairperson of the drafting committee of the Yogyakarta Principles, was appointed as the first United Nations independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. ARC International enthusiastically reported the news. After a year in post, Muntabaun stepped down through illness and was replaced by Victor Madrigal-Borloz, the Secretary-General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims. Madrigal-Borloz was previously a signatory of the Yogyakarta Principles Plus 10 at a second Yogyakarta conference in 2017. The outcome of the second conference were a new set of principles, one of which, Principle 31, requires states to remove sex from all identity documents. Again, this highly radical proposal has not been implemented anywhere in the world. Again, there is no information on who paid for the conference or the basis on which invitations were extended. Other signatories of these later principles included Paul Delane from Wales, at that time Executive Director of the Kaleidoscope Trust and a regular entrant in the annual pink list of the most influential LGBT plus people in Wales. Mauro Cabral Grinspan, the executive director of GATE, and Vitit Munteborn himself. In 2015, the Open Society Foundations produced a document called License to Be Yourself, Trans Children and Youth, that encourages affirmation of children who say they are trans. The document stresses that advocates emphasise human rights issues in advancing their agenda. It makes reference to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Yogyakarta Principles to argue the case that a child should be free to choose their own gender. The document states, legal gender recognition is set out in Yogyakarta Principle 3, the right to recognition before the law. It acknowledges that every person's self-defined gender identity is one of the most basic aspects of their self-determination, dignity and freedom. In 2022, Madrigal Borlos echoed these demands in a video he released on his Twitter feed. In this video, he argues for the pubertal suppression of children who want it, and repeats the claim that puberty blockers are reversible.
The Convention on the Rights of the Child establishes the best interest of the child as a priority, as well as the child's right to express views in accordance with their age and maturity. There is no reason not to acknowledge a child's agency in relation to their gender identity. To proceed otherwise would be discriminatory. The evidence suggests that most children typically develop the ability to recognize and label stereotypical gender groups, such as girl, woman, and feminine, boy, man, and masculine, around age 2. Most of them will also start to categorize their own gender by age 3, and will have a stable sense of gender identity before age 6. Studies show that receiving gender-affirming treatment at an early age increases a person's lifelong well-being and mental health. Those who had access to pubertal suppression had lower odds of lifetime suicidal ideation when compared to those who wanted treatment but did not receive it. Pubertal suppression therapy is also a reversible process. Gender-affirming treatment obviously must be holistically undertaken, with a system of support that includes children themselves, their families, and persons with relevant expertise. Denying a child the agency to consent to gender recognition procedures will likely include the risk of persecution, abuse, violence, discrimination, not only during her youth, but afterwards. It can initiate a cycle of marginalization that will affect him for the rest of his life. We must not leave them behind.
On the surface, Madrigal Borlos appears to spend a lot of time with trans activists, funded by billionaire philanthropists, and little time with those who raise concerns about the social factors influencing our children. He was a signatory of YP+10 before he took up his current United Nations role. And he is pictured here with Mauro Cabral Grinspan. And this picture is on the homepage of GATE. It is fair to ask how independent this UN independent expert really is. From 2007, the Argus Foundation started massively funding campaign organisations that focus on trans concerns. Some of those organisations once campaigned for those who were same-sex attracted. Organisations who add the T get lots of money. Organisations that don't. One organisation that does get lots of money is Astrea Lesbian Foundation for Justice. It is a grant-making body distributing money to activists around the world. A screenshot of their website from 2003 shows that at that time this organisation focused exclusively on lesbian interests. A screenshot of their website now shows that their focus has changed. Their 2021 annual report is entitled Queering Philanthropy. The website Influence Watch highlights some interesting connections with Open Society Foundations and the former executive director of GATE, Justus Eisfeld. The Foundation's 2020 annual report included a letter from Sandy Nathan, the interim executive director, which contained quite an extraordinary statement from a director of a major charity. In July, we took an organisation-wide pause for 2 weeks. The pause was an opportunity for Astrea staff to step away from our desks and reflect on how we can step more into being as opposed to doing. We examined our internal practices as we work to be an organisation that is truly anti-racist, intersectional, feminist, queer and international. We recognise the pause as not just a vacation, but as a radical, political, subversive act, one that rejects dominant capitalist and white supremacist definitions of productivity as tied to success, and instead disrupts by embracing rest, care and joy as critical to the health of our people and therefore the health of Astrea. From 2007 to 2021, Astrea Lesbian Foundation has received $12,224,300 from Arcus Foundation, whose white founder is heir to a multi-billion-dollar medical corporation. From 2016 to 2020, the organisation received $2,170,850 from Open Society Foundations, whose white founder is one of the most successful financial investors of all time. The funds that the organisation receives compares very favourably with the money received by the LGB Alliance, who don't add the T. The LGB Alliance was set up in 2019 by two lesbians. Bev Jackson, the only woman who attended the very first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front, and Kate Harris, a former Stonewall ambassador. The organisation aims to defend the interests of those who are same-sex attracted. Their aims are listed on their website. These are aims that are underpinned by the knowledge that a person can't change sex. One of the most well-known trans women in South Wales is Alex Drummond. Alex sits on the Stonewall Trans Advisory Board. Alex claims that he is a woman. He has not undergone gender reassignment surgery and has not taken hormones. He also claims that he is a lesbian.
Alex, I live just above Cardiff. I am a trans woman and I live full-time as a trans woman, but I'm also widening the bandwidth of how to be a woman.
Mark Drakeford appears to agree.
That transgender women are women.
The LGB Alliance disagree.
Well, the problem really emerges in 2015. Under the leadership of Ruth Hunt, Stonewall changed its definition from same-sex to same-gender relationships. And when you change sex to gender in that way, you do something very odd, because we support the rights of people whose sexual orientation is to members of the same sex.
Yes.
So two men or two women. If you start talking about gender, and I'm afraid you won't find anybody who can ever define what it means except in some sort of funny circular way, then the whole idea of same-sex relationships disappears. It goes out of the window. How can you stand up for it anymore if you say same gender?
Yes.
And in particular, this was a problem for lesbians, because quite a lot of men were identifying as women and therefore calling themselves lesbians. And this was causing and is causing and has caused enormous problems, and we felt that it was necessary to address those problems.
But stating facts has resulted in the most extraordinary attacks from politicians, journalists and celebrities. Lou Thomas is a very influential figure within the Welsh Government and was chair of the independent LGBTQ+ expert panel that drew up a LGBTQ+ action plan that was released for consultation in July 2021. LGB Alliance were not represented on the panel. In a tweet, Lou Thomas compared inviting the LGB Alliance to help draw up a LGBTQ+ action plan to inviting the English Defence League to write a race action plan. The truth appears to be transphobic. The only way Alex Drummond can be a woman is if we change the definition of words. So how did Alex Drummond become convinced that he was a woman?
I think it's kind of important to communicate the idea of transgender, illustrate the possibilities. I mean, I'd never even heard of transgender before the age of 40, and it was only when I was researching gender theory as part of my master's that I discovered all this amazing science.